Hello again, everybody. My name is John T. Healy. I do a podcast. It's good to talk, and sure, it's good to talk. I always have interesting people on. Today will be another interesting guest. I got into podcasting because I produced this book for my good friend Stoney McGurn a few years back before the lockdown and Corona and all that. And it's his story from 1941. My sponsors are Liffey Van Lines, moving company here in New York City, and they've been around longer than Jeopardy, running very, very smoothly, getting very, very busy coming into the summer months. I always give a shout out to my friend Paddy McCarthy of the Irish Examiner newspaper, a great paper here in the New York State area, brings you up to date on music and festivals, little bits of news from across the pond as well. And there'll be more about across the pond today with my guest. Jimmy Grady will be on to sing a song later on for us. Today will be a special song too. But let me get right to my guest. Today I have Martin Dillon, all the way from Belfast. Martin, thanks for being on the show. You have a book to talk about. Are you talking to me from Belfast?
No, John, actually, I'm talking to you from Eastern Europe. My wife is from Bulgaria, so I make a kind of annual pilgrimage to her part of the world. So that's where I'm speaking to you from at the moment.
All right, well, we have a good, clear reception. But you were born in Belfast, is that right?
Yes, I was born in a very small house in a very small street off the Falls Road in West Belfast. The area was dominated by the twin spires of St. Peter's Pro-Cathedral at that stage. It's now a cathedral, I understand. Okay. So I was born really in the heart of what later became the centre of the Troubles in Belfast.
Okay, so you grew up there. You grew up during the Troubles, I would assume,
Well, I grew up I grew up in a period when Northern Ireland was seemingly fairly calm. So, I was born in 9.
Okay.
And so I was a boy during the border campaign between 56 and 62. And then, I was educated in England for a time. So when I came back to Northern Ireland from school in England, things were beginning to be slightly frayed. Paisley was on the rampage at that time in the 60s, mid-60s. And things were getting very, very seriously tight, politically.
Yeah. Ian Paisley, for the sake of my listeners here in the New York area, was the leader of the DUP, the Protestant section of the Troubles, we call it. And he was good at shouting and ranting and blowing his mouth off and stirring it up for his side. Aside from that, I heard on the streets that he was quite a good politician in general, just that when he got in front of the cameras, he wanted to brag and boast and mock the church and mock the Pope and anything that would bring his side up and bring the Catholics down. Go ahead.
I think, John, at that time in the 60s, Paisley was a very malign influence politically. He drove the society towards sectarian violence because of the kind of ideas he promoted and because of his anti-Catholic position on so many issues. And, it was a time when the civil rights movement was coming into being. Paisley didn't want Catholics to have British civil rights. This was Northern Ireland. It was part of the United Kingdom. And so what Catholics were asking for were the same rights as other people in the United Kingdom. And Paisley didn't want that. So Paisley was a very dangerous ingredient in the politics of the time.
I agree with that. He was also a member of the European Union at the time, European Parliament, and he was kicked out of there one day for protesting, which was, a kind of a disgrace, but a good way to get the world media on who the hell is this guy. And I believe he had a degree of piece of paper from some university here in the United States, but that's neither here nor there. Paper is paper.
The Bob Jones University, I think it was called.
What was it called?
I think it was called the Bob Jones University.
Okay. No relation.
I don't know, but I think it may have been.
Well, maybe he should have gone to Trump University. In any event, you have written a book. Tell me about the book you have produced yourself.
Well, I've written a book called The Sorrow and the Loss, the Tragic Shadow Cast by the Troubles in the Lives of Women. I'd written so many books over the years about the conflict. Starting in the early 70s, one of the first books was published by the Troubles was Political Murder. Then I wrote books like The Dirty War, Shankle Butchers, God and the Gun, Stone Cold, Killer in Clowntown, The Triggermen. And, I'd written all these books, and I was sitting on a beach a couple of years ago, and I was thinking, what am I going to write next? And it struck me that I had never written about women and in the conflict, in the Troubles. Nobody had, really. Women were a kind of forgotten ingredient, and yet they were a very, very important element within it.
Well, it's very interesting you mentioned that, because I had Councillor Jerry Coyle on here. We did a podcast similar to what we're talking to you right now. It's good to talk. People can subscribe. And Jerry Coyle was writing about his father, who, from County Mayo, a place called Guisala. And anyone that knows Guisala, it's a beautiful place, beautiful scenery. but his father often told him, you just can't eat scenery, you have to be able to put food on the table. But myself and Jerry, we did go over the merits and the influence of Minona here and the women of Ireland. But tell me more about your production, where you have focused with this book on the women of Northern Ireland during the Troubles, I guess maybe before and after. They were significant influence.
Well, one of the things that struck me when I was a young reporter in the early days of the Troubles, the mothers had a very, very difficult problem. I mean, they were trying to run families at a time when, soldiers were on the streets, when there were bombings taking place, when there were gun battles. Young people, were drawn into the conflict. And, the thing is that the mothers couldn't really keep the kids off the streets. It was impossible. There was a lot of anger, a lot of resentment of the fact that what was going on. And armies are not built for peacekeeping. Let's be clear about it. So the British Army came in with a mindset which really was built by colonial experiences in places like Kenya, Aden, Cyprus. So this was an army that wasn't built to sort of come into Belfast, and it wasn't Birmingham, and it wasn't Liverpool. This was a place apart, a place they didn't really understand anyway. So in the midst of all this, you had mothers trying to cope, and you had mothers trying to cope during internment when either their husbands or girls, boyfriends, were picked up and taken off and interned. So all these things were going on. And there was no sense in which the Troubles were impacting the lives of women. And they really did very, very seriously. Not just women who got involved. In other words, who became part of either the IRA war or women who joined let's say, the RUC. I wanted to look at women on both sides. And so I ended up sort of talking to all kinds of women. I remember talking to a girl who married a loyalist assassin, and who beat her. And she was very, very honest about the way in which the Troubles impacted her. So in many ways, I thought to myself, well, what happened to a lot of women during the Troubles? Why did some of them get involved?
Well,
in paramilitary activity, for example.
I'm glad you kind of go into that sphere of it, and we will open up that a little bit more. In other discussions I've had with Brian Layden here, a historian that's on here quite a bit, is the British soldiers at the time that they were asked to come into Northern Ireland on behalf of the British government to keep peace or stop each other from killing each other. These were young men. They had no notion of probably even where or what Northern Ireland was all about. And they were just young, innocent soldiers put there, not knowing what to do, to shoot, to kill, or to separate or keep peace. And the ironic thing about it was, at that time, the British taxpayer was paying for these British soldiers to be in Northern Ireland. And these young men would rather be anywhere else than be in Northern Ireland. And meanwhile, as the British taxpayer is paying for these soldiers to be there in the bog site where you're a part neck of the woods. Here in America, especially in New York and Manhattan and the Bronx and Queens, Irish Americans had such resentment. They were having fundraisers, paying money to have those British soldiers assassinated and killed. Every weekend there was functions and people were throwing their money to kill a British soldier. So on one hand, the British taxpayer is paying a soldier to be there. An Irish American, his great-grandfather and grandmother is here saying they hate the British without knowing the essence of it.
Well, nobody did. You see, the one thing, John, is very striking about that early period. The British government didn't know. When the Troubles broke out, the British Home Secretary at the time, Reginald Maudling, went into the Home Office to find out what intelligence they had in Northern Ireland. And he found Northern Ireland in a dusty folder, and that was the only thing in the Home Office they had, because nobody really knew much about Northern Ireland. I spoke to a diplomat who came to Northern Ireland in the 60s, and he said to me it was like a place apart. He said, I went over there and we just played golf. That was the attitude. Yeah. But underneath his golfing, there was a lot of really nasty stuff going on. Catholics were being discriminated against in housing, in jobs, and politically. But that was being ignored because the British government didn't want to know. The British government's attitude was the unionists are running the place, let them take care of it.
Well, you've explained that very, very well. And if we take the story of the Titanic, there wasn't one Catholic labourer, carpenter, engineer hired on it was all Protestant people that was hired by the British government or the unions themselves.
Well, this was it, yeah. It was a situation really in a way where I think Northern Ireland had been just a hidden factor in British policy making. In other words, Westminster had the moral and political responsibility, constitutionally as well, for Northern Ireland, and had just ignored it over 50 years. So when everything broke out, the first instinct was, okay, we have to protect the Catholics. But then it became something much more sinister because they left the Unionist government in place. They left in place people who had been running the place down for 50 years, and then left them there. So they were able to influence the policy making of the British Army at that time. Heath, for instance, I'll give you an example. Heath ordered me out of his house in Salisbury after I sort of revealed that at a cabinet meeting, a secret cabinet meeting at 10 Downing Street, he had suggested to one of his generals that soldiers in the streets of Northern Ireland were entitled to shoot protesters because they were enemies of the Crown. And Heath, went crazy, ordered me out of his house. Phoned Channel 4 at the time, asked them to ban the programme, said I was in possession of classified information, but he didn't deny it. It was true. And that was the kind of policy making that was still going on in 1971 and after a term in 1972. So this was a long war really was being built because of the absurdity of British policy making in many respects.
Well, Martin Dillon, you're with me today on a podcast called It's Good to Talk, and you're certainly welcome in my house. Absolutely, 100% welcome here. If people like the podcast, they subscribe. Please subscribe, and subscribe by hitting the subscribe button and ringing a bell. It's free, and you'll get more podcasts. Speaking of another podcast I did with Brian Layden, historian, we covered the Good Friday Agreement in detail with one of the longer podcasts. Compared it to what Michael Collins had achieved in 1922, I guess. We got to 26 and said we'll negotiate the other 6 counties later. President de Valera of County Clare, born here in New York City, born here in Lexington Avenue. We know his mother was from Clare. We're not sure where his father was from. I think the father went hiding someplace, not for any good reason. And he objected to the deal done by Michael Collins, and that caused a civil war, and that caused a mess in itself. And that's one thing the British love, is when people start fighting among themselves. Lord Mountbatten, of course, was assassinated by the IRA off the seaside at Sligo, Mullinamore, whatever it's called. And Mullinamore. He wasn't a bad person per se. He gave India back to India. Of course, he divided India and Pakistan, but they're good at leaving the mess. So a lot of
the British were very good at solving things by partitioning countries. I mean, they partitioned what they called as you mentioned it. It was called the Indian subcontinent. So they divided it up between India and Pakistan and left a little place in the middle that India and Pakistan have almost fought a nuclear war over. Yeah. So, that wasn't great policy making by Mountbatten, no. But he wasn't anti-Irish. I mean, he spent a lot of time in Ireland.
Oh no, he wasn't. That's why I say he wasn't a bad person. He was a good, soldier, statesman. I think he was related to Queen Elizabeth, and she was a good woman herself in her own right. She shook hands with Martin McGuinness, to show leadership by example, and put behind all the bad times. But let's get back to your book again. Tell me some of the women that feature in the book and your research on the book.
Well, one of the stories that struck me as very interesting was Mairead Farrell. And as you know, Mairead Farrell was assassinated by the SAS with 2 companions in Gibraltar. And that was a sort of famous event where she's walking through Gibraltar on a Sunday morning with Daniel McCann, and the SAS arrive and they kill her, and they kill her companion. I mean, it was really a fairly brutal assassination of the 3 of them, Savage, McCann, and Farrell. Now, the interesting thing for me was I thought to myself, well, who was this girl, Mairead Farrell? And it turns out she was a young girl who got caught up, as I said, during the early days of the Troubles, a lot of kids out the streets throwing stones at British soldiers and their armoured personnel carriers, are suddenly drawn into the much more serious part of the conflict. And she became a part of the IRA women's organisation, Cumann na mBan. And then eventually she is used in the bombing of a hotel. And in that particular escapade, her boyfriend, who was part of the operation, was killed. She then ends up in Armagh prison, and she's very clever, and she's a highly intelligent young girl. And she takes over the IRA women's section in Armagh prison. And she runs she runs a dirty protest. She also runs a hunger strike at the same time when Bobby Sands and the others were dying in the maze. And yet she almost died. But the fact that she was a woman was significant in the IRA because it was a very misogynist organization that was run by men. So the fact that this woman was running a dirty protest and almost died, and also, a hunger strike, it was ignored. So eventually, when she gets out of prison, she has the right to sort of just go and lead her life. I mean, her friend said it was time for her she paid her price to do something different. She liked dancing and whatever. Sinn Féin drew her back into the IRA, and they did. And she is sent to Gibraltar. Now, the Gibraltar operation struck me as rather peculiar because the late Brendan Hughes, who was an IRA intelligence chief, said to me, that was a crazy one because you don't send three well-known people like Mairead Farrell, McCann and Savage into Gibraltar, because the moment they moved out of Belfast at all and then took flights out of Dublin to Torremolinos, in Spain, they were spotted. They were known. Thatcher knew all about it. Thatcher knew every move they made. So the thing is that, she's killed in Gibraltar. And of course, when her funeral is held in Belfast, there's an attempt to assassinate the IRA leadership. So there's so many other things that happen as a result of that. But here's what's interesting. McGuinness promised the IRA that there would be a big inquiry into the assassination and the fact that operation in Gibraltar was blown. There was never any inquiry at all. And the fact it was betrayed from within the IRA, because you had people like Scappaticci and others. The IRA was at that stage, so penetrated by British intelligence. The moment that Farrell went to Gibraltar, everything was known about the operation. Yeah. And so I wanted to look at her and why. I mean, she'd been drawn into this. She could have had a different kind of life. But she was one of these kids on the streets who became something else,
Well, yes, a different type of life. You're right in saying that. But the same could be said maybe for Bobby Sands, who died in 1981 of hunger strike. And he became a member of the British Parliament too. Now, speaking of the MPs, like Bernadette Devlin McAllister, also, I don't know if she features in your book or not, but she became an MP, member of the British Parliament. But she made use of being in there to highlight the issues that needed to be highlighted. And she was another intelligent woman. She studied at Queen's University in Belfast. She studied psychology. But Gibraltar itself is only a rock. It's an island. It's owned by the British. And it's stuck in the middle of somewhere over there between a couple other countries. And it's good for nothing, only maybe a bit of smuggling and a bit of duty-free. Unlike the Falkland Islands, or the Malvinas as they're known, which is populated by sheep. And we know all about that history, sad history too, just off the coast of Argentina. But
that was Margaret Thatcher too. That was Thatcher also.
Well, Margaret Thatcher, I've called her a cunt before on this podcast, so I'm just repeating myself. But she got help from the Reagan here, the American government, and they said it was weather reports. I don't think people are that naive when Reagan is kissing in Margaret Thatcher's arse that he's given her the weather report. But let's get back to your book, Martin Dillon, my guest. Who else features in the book in terms of Minona Hearn?
I also looked at Rosemary Nelson, who was a very sort of famous lawyer. She was a Catholic lawyer, very clever. She probably was one of those people that just had, the kind of courage that very few of us have. That right throughout the troubles while she lived her part of her life in it, she worked for all her clients. But she was in Lurgan. Even the policemen in her local station thought that she was such a good lawyer. When they were sort of having problems, whether they were marital or with property, they came to her. Okay. But then other people realized the same thing, and they were Republicans, and they thought, well, if she's such a good lawyer, she can represent us. The moment she started representing Republicans was the moment that members of the RUC began to demonize her. They spread rumors about her, nasty rumors. They spread it through loyalism. MI5, Special Branch, in fact, Special Branch bugged her offices for 3 years. And the thing about it was, I discovered, no one knows why and who gave them the authority to do it. It had to come through MI5 and through Tony Blair's government. Tony Blair has never sort of said anything about it. Now, she was someone who, I think was very courageous. She gave a talk to Congress, to the U.S. Congress. And the other thing, too, about her was she represented anyone. But someone really had it in for her. And at the end of the day, when she is killed, she's killed by a bomb placed under her car. And the loyalists didn't have the technology to use that, to create that kind of bomb, which was a mercury tilt switch device. It was placed under her car near her house. And there was no security around her house at that time when that was placed. And also, she'd been threatened by loyalists. She was given no protection. And I think that there was an element of collusion with British intelligence in the killing of this woman because she was such a powerful figure and a powerful advocate for people who were, competing with the justice system for fairness. She was another woman whose life was impacted terribly by the Troubles.
Right. Well, that's history, to say the least. I'm going to call on my young friend, Jimmy Grady, to sing a song for us. Today he's actually going to sing a song, a Gaelic in the Irish language, and he gives a great rendition of this song, and his Gaelic is perfectly clear, and you know, of course, that the British government itself didn't allow Gaelic Irish to be taught in Northern Ireland. They didn't allow Irish history to be taught in Northern Ireland. So it's nice to see the next generation or young generation keeping some of it. Jimmy, please give a song for Martin Dillon and myself and my guest. Thank you, Jimmy.
Buhilan Ernest may brag, Fin Colleen Jesso. Near Fin Bo Spray Lady, Tommy Fin Sever Galore. Son Kirky of a Gahi Galana Sharon. Smyrna Permel Bases Mantir Ergonde Wio. Rahi May Moraka Yin of Lana Funkyo. Gon Queecha Gon Bod Gon Granny Bracker Bithlam. Actiller na grieve, Mare de Lapos, McKeon, Shoro Shockmanum Jaku to Fay, Shinterum and all. Bulak Bo Malone, our clock measuria. Akeg Immertsegole. Hagna jasa fashliv, Makame mastor ni doiger kame mahil, as ni molam da pog brogatag hayav leblin.
Jimmy, thank you very much for that beautiful song. My guest is Martin Dillon. I'm back to Martin Dillon. Here he's produced a book and he's more than that. Tell me, Martin, about your background. You were a reporter for the Belfast News, and what else? Did you do work with the BBC or?
Yeah, I was a reporter with the Irish News, with the Belfast Telegraph. I was a BBC producer and editor. I also did work. I did work for later for some of the English channels like Channel 4. For Sky News, I was a terrorism expert. But when I was in Northern Ireland, the BBC, I knew John Hume. You mentioned John Hume earlier on. Yes. I knew John very well. I was the one who made a live program, 1 hour program, between Hume and Adams on the BBC. It was the first time the two of them talked publicly, and it was the beginning of Hume's contact with the IRA. That was the beginning of that process. I also introduced Hume to John McMichael, who was the head of the UDA and ran the UDA death squads. He wanted to meet John Hume, and I arranged that as well. And another thing that you might be interested in, John, is that John Major sent one of his leading figures in his cabinet, David Davis, to ask me if the British government could do a deal with Gerry Adams, with the IRA. And I said, yes, they could, because Adams wanted to be part of a solution in Ireland politically to the problem. But they would have to keep him alive, and that would mean they'd have to get Martin McGuinness involved. And that's what they did. That was what they did. So I had this meeting. I was asked, would I meet David Davis to talk about this? And I said, yes, why not? I'm a writer. I'm a journalist. I have nothing to hide. I'm quite willing to tell them what I think,
Well, when you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Yeah. That's the way it goes. And of course, love and war, easy to start, hard to end.
So I saw a lot as a reporter. I met a lot of people over the years. Some nice people, some very dangerous people.
Of course.
Some people who threatened me, and others who,
Well, John Hume indeed was a man of peace, Because I used to meet him frequently down in Mayo at the Humbert School down there in the summertime, and he was a very, very kind and peaceful man. The essence of peace, indeed, and he was instrumental in the Good Friday Agreement, as well as other Bill Clinton at the time was instrumental, George Mitchell, Mulholland, like everybody had the same end plan in sight, and that was the peace. And I always shout out for the unity of Ireland eventually through peaceful means, not with the bomb, not with the bullet. And I know Mary Lou is aiming at 2030, which is a few years away, 5 years, I guess, to have the vote, which is written into the Good Friday Agreement, that the majority of people, if they want United Ireland, they can vote for United Ireland. And I think now the people of Northern Ireland are aware too. We're a part of Europe now. We're part of a bigger picture. And it's better for trade, it's better for marketing, it's better for commerce to be part of the European market and to put away the parish politics, we call it. Get away from the Paisley time of shouting at the parish pump and insulting the Pope and insulting Catholic people in the South.
So I think there's a greater dynamic now politically for change in Ireland. I mean, it's a small island. People who live in that island have an important role to play in the future. To see themselves as part of an island, I mean, and to see themselves also beyond it, and to see themselves as Europe. And Ireland, I always thought, was only Ireland of Ireland is the world in a way, that you can't isolate yourself. You can't have, you can't sort of divide property or divide land and say, well, got two different. It's a small island. I think that younger people look at it very, very differently. And I'm hoping that the end of the Troubles and the Good Friday Agreement will have seen the kind of possibilities for change. It's up to people to make up their own minds, but I think that there's a better platform for doing that now than there was in the past.
I totally agree. I mean, I've no problem with the Protestants, having their big orange parades and their orange this and their orange that. And speaking of orange, we should get some orange juice. So United Ireland is there by peaceful means, by the vote, which was written into the Good Friday Agreement, as I said earlier. So I think 2030 would be the time for all people to seize it. I know here in New York, where I am, Irish Americans, it has been their dream since their grandparents arrived here, as a result of the famine being one thing and, the Tahalo to Connacht, where I'm from, when Cromwell invaded Ireland and kept all the good stuff and shoved us away over to the west of Ireland, which turned out to be kind of a beautiful place in itself.
Well, I think if a Good Friday Agreement could be crafted, and it was, then I think that there is room for even greater change in Ireland. But there's still things that, in writing this book, there's still things that people need to know. There are things about the past they need to know. For example, in this book, I talk about something that I revealed back when I wrote The Dirty War in 1988, and that was about the secret burials by the IRA. That they secretly buried people. I mean, many of the remains of the disappeared, as they're called, have since been found, but there's still some that haven't. There is one, an IRA officer called Joe Lynchky, whose remains have yet to be found, and a young man. But the one in the book, I deal with some of the women, and there's one that Americans know about now because of the whole Disney thing. And that was the book Say Nothing by an American called Radden Keefe, and that was about Jean McConville. The mother who was taken by the IRA, and her remains were only discovered in recent times after several decades. But the guy who wrote that book, Radden Keefe, he told America and the Disney thing that he'd solved the whole problem, that mystery of what happened to her. The one thing he didn't know, and I discovered writing this book, was that there were 3 people at the grave when she was shot. Now, I was told that each of them fired a bullet into Jean McConville when she was standing in the grave or kneeling in the grave, so that not one of them could be regarded as her actual killer. What Radden Keefe, who wrote this book, this American, didn't know, there were 3 people watching the execution. There were 3 grave diggers, and one of them was a guy who was working as an agent for the Irish police force Garda Síochána. And he was allowed after this, when he was unmasked by the IRA allowed him, because his father was a senior IRA commander, to make a new life in America. Instead of shooting him, to let him go. So there were witnesses to the Jean McConville killing that nobody knew about. So Disney doesn't have that part of the story. But I looked at Jean McConville, and I looked at another young woman called Caroline Morland. And she was the last one assassinated by the IRA before the war ended. And this is a very short time before it ended, because they said she was an informer. Right. But the interesting thing about her was that the authorities must have known where she was being held and didn't make an attempt to rescue her. Yes, she was an informer, She'd been
Right.
pressed into informing about the IRA, but she was
Right.
also having an affair with a leading IRA figure who made no attempt to plead for her life.
Right.
And she was the last one taken down the country, made to kneel down, and was executed. It's a very, very sad story.
That's
These are the stories of women in this book. There are different types of women. There was a young policewoman called Tracy Ellen Doug, who was a great Irish dancer. And she became a member of the RUC because her father was. I mean, she was a child. She would dress up in her father's hat and, in his jacket, his uniform. And she ends up being blown up with three of her colleagues near the border while they were meeting a van coming from Dublin with currency. She was just a young woman. I mean, she would have had a really good career. Her mother was an Irish dancer as well. They were Protestants, but they really loved the Irish culture. These are the kind of women that in this book who were tragically impacted by the Troubles.
Well, a lot of innocence. Like my good friend Donnacha Dooling, who was a reporter with RTE, was fired by RTE for bringing toys to the north of Ireland one Christmas, and that was RTE at the time, state-run organisation, RTE. Speaking of other journalists, you must have come across another woman, a favourite of mine too, Nell McCafferty.
Nell, I knew Nell well. She was a wonderful human being, wonderful. And when I was in the BBC, I employed her sometimes, and also Eamon McCann. I employed both of them because they were really good writers, and they worked for a programme I created, which is still run in Northern Ireland. It's the longest running programme in the history of the BBC in the United Kingdom, called Talkback. And I created Talkback, and Nell McCafferty was a regular contributor, and so was Eamon McCann. Nell was great girl, very, very good writer, good reporter.
Well, I met Nell several times, and of course her partner at the time was Nuala Phelan, another journalist from Dublin.
Yes, yeah.
They were a perfect match. They did a lot for women's rights, and indeed, the lesbian organisation for that era, for that time. To be a couple, two ladies, two journalists, to have such a relationship and to travel everywhere, north and south, and promote women's rights. I think that was a huge, huge milestone for the gay lesbian community in itself.
John, unless I'm wrong, was Nuala Phelan the daughter of the famous Sean O'Phelan, who was the great short story writer? Yeah,
he was a short story writer, and he went under like an alias when he would write for the Dublin papers.
That's right. He went to America at one stage, and then his work in Ireland was banned. I interviewed him as a young man. I interviewed him. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Nuala and Nell, their relationship was iconic, to say the least. So let's see, did we leave anyone out? We did mention Bernadette Devlin McAllister briefly. I mean, she was here in the States as well, and she was excellent, and she's still alive. Nell died only a number of years ago at the age of 80 years old. Bernadette Devlin McAllister is, as we speak.
Bernadette's one of those iconic figures. She's in the book, and so is her daughter.
Good.
Who went through an unfortunate experience and was accused of being involved in bombings in Europe. And then the case against her was dropped, and she was pregnant at the time she was arrested and interrogated. Bernadette, I found over the years, was a very truthful figure anytime I interviewed her. A bit like Michael Farrell. Michael Farrell's another figure I had a lot of respect for. Some of those early people in the days of the civil rights movement, Eamon McCann as well, they were very straightforward, and and are great sort of commentators on the past.
Yes, I mean, we were lucky and blessed to have good people like that. Bernadette McAllister herself was shot, I think, 9 times by the British soldiers.
She was shot in her home, yes.
In her home, yes. And she survived it. And she's, 79 years old. Not terribly old, not terribly young. But a lot of those people are well worthy of being in your book. My guest is Martin Dillon, journalist and writer from Belfast. And I'm here in New York, John D. Healy. If you like the podcast, do subscribe. Hit the button, it's free. And catch up on more history. And another podcast I'll give a shout out to here in New York is the Irish Stew, Martin Nutty and John Lee. And they would love to have you on, Martin, and you should put you in contact with them for maybe a more in-depth interview, because they're very good at when it comes to interviews and podcasts dealing with Belfast in particular. They've done a lot of work there themselves, both those guys. So shout out for the Irish Stew if you like podcasting. So
that's great.
Tell me, Martin, where can people get your book?
It's on .com, Barnes and Noble.
Okay.
So it'll be through those two outlets. Amazon.com obviously is the easiest one for most.
You clearly have more than one book, but the one we were talking about today in particular is to do with the women of Northern Ireland, Minona Hearden. You don't have a copy there. I know you're in Eastern Europe now.
Yeah, this is the one. This is the one here.
The Sorrow and the Loss.
Yes, yeah.
Okay,
So that's it.
Okay, and that's available on Amazon as well. Okay.
It is indeed, John. Yes.
And I must commend you. A lot of hard work to write a book, put it out there, research it. Proofreading is like weeding a garden. So you really are a great man, a great person, and all your work with the BBC and the various newspapers. So I'm going to give you the last word because it's good to talk.
No, it's great to talk to you. I mean, one of the things that I find writing this book was that there are so many women who were really powerful figures. I often wonder, John, if women had been more in control of events during the conflict, it might have ended a lot sooner. Because I think that they would have had a clearer vision. Because all the women I spoke to who survived this or whose loved ones died or were assassinated, they were all didn't disagree with each other at all. Their whole attitude really was just tell us the truth. We want the truth.
Well,
those are women who would have, I think, fought for the truth had they been given an opportunity earlier in the conflict.
Well, my father drilled that into me. He'd always say, shame the devil and tell the truth. But in the modern world we live in, the truth is tarnished a lot and abused a lot.
It's
difficult to find. Martin, it's been good talking to you on It's Good to Talk. My name is John D. Healy. Do subscribe.